Georgian, our Europe editor. Armen, set the scene for us of the geopolitics at play and why it means so much for Armenia.
Yeah, well, Gavin, Armenia is in a really tight spot geopolitically because, as you said, it's landlocked and it has two of its borders closed. So the report you just saw was from Voskepar, which is up here on the top right of the border with Azerbaijan. That entire border down here is closed. The entire western border of Armenia with Turkey is also closed. That only leaves Armenia with two outlets. One is to Iran in the south and Georgia in the north. The Armenian state now has growing problems with Russia because of Armenia's pivot to the west. And that's very important because Russia supplies gas to Armenia at preferential rates. Iran also supplies gas to Armenia. So the big question is, as Armenia tries to turn towards Europe, are Russia and Iran going to play the energy card against Armenia at some point and say, well, if you continue on this path, we're not going to give you this gas anymore or give it to you not at the preferential rates that Russia currently gives Armenia. The only slightly bright spot for Armenia now, Gavin, is Georgia, because this border is open, links are flourishing, and as you know, Georgia recently got candidate status to one day join the European Union. That point was mentioned in this press conference this morning in Brussels, and the goal of the EU is to create a kind of integrated zone between Armenia and Georgia with things like interconnectors, electricity infrastructure, renewable energy, all those things. But actual EU membership for either of these countries is clearly very, very far away still.
I think that sets a clear picture, Armen, doesn't it? When you think about the population of Armenia too, fewer than 3 million. Now, then it brings us to the scenes here in Brussels today. So this is Ursula von der Leyen granting an EU package worth around $300 million today. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
I also welcome the measures that Armenia has taken against the circumvention of our sanctions against Russia, in particular to make sure that lethal equipment and technologies do not end up in the hands of Russian military. This shows that the European Union and Armenia are increasingly aligned in values and interests.
If we look at the other side, Armen, why does this matter to the EU right now?
Well, it matters partly because of the whole sanctions circumvention issue, which we heard President von der Leyen talking about there. They're trying to close any backdoors, any loopholes in how sanctions on Russia are being run around, basically. And so Armenia is part of that whole jigsaw puzzle. We have to note that last year, the Armenian authorities tightened restrictions on the delivery of things like transformers, microchips, electronic devices to Russia. So that is, for Brussels, an important point. Of course, Ursula von der Leyen was talking about growing trade links as well between Russia and the EU and financial support from the EU to Armenian small and medium-sized businesses. But there's a paradox here that actually, if you look at the figures last year, Armenia's trade with Russia was still much bigger than its trade with the EU. So the trade with Russia was still 35% last year. With the EU, it was only 13%. And while we talk about this Armenian pivot to the West, we have to remember that formally Armenia is still a member of the CSTO, which is a Russian-led security organization. It's still part of the Eurasian Economic Union. So it's part of all these structures that are really the legacy or the fruit of more than 30 years of Armenia's foreign policy since the 1990s when it became independent. You can't just reverse that overnight, obviously.
But in brief, Armen, nearly $300 billion is $1 million is a start, but I'm guessing given the desperate need for those people who've left and Nagorno-Karabakh, probably only just a start, nowhere near enough.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an element of sort of, moral support as well that I think is being felt in Armenia, that the EU is sort of trying to back a country which had this so-called Velvet Revolution a few years ago that wanted to become part of the West. And certainly if you talk to people in Armenia, Gavin, they will say very similar things to what Ukrainians will tell you, which is that they are a kind of very individualistic society. They don't have a collectivist mentality, following a strong leader, an authoritarian strongman. That is not possible in Armenia any more than it's possible in Ukraine. So there are kind of some similarities in terms of mentality, I would say, but Armenia can't change its borders, it can't change its neighbors. So that is the real difficulty for Armenia going forward, I think, with any kind of EU integration in the future. It has not applied to join the European Union for now, but that is certainly discussions that are being had in the Armenian government.
Really interesting, great context. Armen Georgian.